All right, good afternoon and happy almost Friday, going into a weekend of July 4th and Independence Day weekend, which just just foremost is just it's very timely that we put on this topic, and it was very strategic that we've rescheduled it to today because the way we see it, we oftentimes give a pass for Independence Day weekend, and we pride ourselves, a lot of folks pride themselves on the history of this country, but in that history, there's been a lot of perpetual systems and structures that have oppressed a lot of different folks, folks of color, LGBTQ folks, low income folks, first generation college students, you name it. So oftentimes it gets hidden. So we got together as a DWB Executive Board to kind of create a space, I'd say an alternative space to kind of call these out and discuss them as they pertain to higher education and the design industry in itself. And not just like, a lot of our program before has been talking about like us as designers, but more specifically how the impact of design can have on communities. So we invite folks to talk about that in this space as well. So that being said, a couple of things I just want to preface in kind of the norms of this podcast. I think for recording purposes and speaking purposes, if everyone just can mute themselves and unmute themselves when they're ready to speak. We're not at 100 people in this room, so it shouldn't be that much of an issue. Also in that, we're going to a space where we're tackling an issue and moving things forward, and by highlighting these actions and creating action among ourselves. So in that space, I do ask that we consider this a brave space, and that we feel welcome to share, and that we find comfort in discomfort should some of these topics come up. And I also invite folks to bring personal experiences into it. Just know that this is also going to end up on YouTube. So should there be something you don't want to share, in the long run, be mindful of that as well. Okay. So that being said, I just wanted us to give a platform to have an update about what's been happening socio-politically across the country and the world since our last episode. So Victor, if you want to highlight some of the things I know you've been passionate about, but that we've been discussing and we've all been discussing in our space.
Yeah, sure. So just going off of what Roberto said, there's just continuous, like not necessarily the big, huge leap in progress, but there's been the recent police reform that happened here in Colorado, here more locally, and just being able to get rid of that immunity with individual police officers. And just more recently, the death of Elijah that happened over a year ago and got a lot of traction over this past weekend as far as the protesting went in Aurora, Colorado, and really calling that out with local authorities. Those are just a couple of things here happening locally. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else on the national scale, or if anybody else would like to add on to what's obviously happening nationally, but more specifically with kind of the specifics that I touched up on as far as like reform goes.
Yeah. Bad feedback there, but I'd say overall, the COVID has exacerbated, or COVID-19 and the pandemic situation has just exacerbated a lot of these historical rooted social inequities. So a lot of people are tense, as we've seen, there was a couple that brandished firearms to protesters, and under a pretext. So a lot of these things have always been there. COVID has just kind of brought this to light. And a lot of these communities, underrepresented communities, have been suffering a lot more. I think we've also seen a lot of action, positive action, from two parts. We have a lot of legislative reform that's already happened. So the petitioning has been working, for most part. We've seen a lot of folks being brought into the space and unlearning, and learning at the same time, calling out their own privileges and being allies and advocates. At the same time, we're also seeing the type of I would consider a face value, like, a face value response to this. So a lot of, corporate entities and things are posting like Black Lives Matter, but not really being intentional behind it. So I think one thing I've also seen, and like I said, this is just an open conversation on this, but I've seen a recent trend about animators or voice actors who voice characters of color on sorts of taking a step back and finally saying, oh, this should have been a person of color all along. So, you know, that's something that's kind of doesn't really ask the question, you know, and the response is, that's great, but we're asking for police reform. So there's a lot of folks who are just doing something, but not being intentional behind it. And I think in talking about it, that's where the intentionality comes out from. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Two things that I've noticed is that there were still protests going on, you know, far after the media was covering it. So essentially, like, the media kind of shied away from it to what I think an effort to not encourage those kind of actions. So that's just something that I've been noticing. Like, some of those protests are still happening / were still happening even after they were reporting them. But I'm glad there exist channels for, you know, activists to get together and still show up to kind of show what is really needed in reform that the media kind of just stopped covering. And I think it really shows kind of how a lot of us are products of media, essentially. Like, if you're following the media and you don't see protests anymore, like, the population kind of starts thinking like, oh, well, that kind of died out, or like that fizzled out. But I think, like, just staying connected with other forms of communication is really important, because you're able to see essentially what the media isn't covering, and sometimes that information is probably more accurate than some of the stuff that the media wants to or doesn't want to cover. So that's one piece. And then the other piece that I wanted to mention real quick too is kind of this debate that is going on right now, where a lot of people in the media are saying that because of these protests, now we're in the situation where COVID has spiked, and we're unsafe again, and we have to close down a lot of things because of the protesters that exposed themselves, and then we have more COVID cases now because of that. I would just say, be critical about that information and do your own research to see if that's actually true. Because once again, I kind of think that that's the media wanting to implement some of their thoughts or some of their agenda points.
I would also like to add in the fact that I think someone mentioned it, how some of, like, the whole Black Lives Matter thing for some people was but a trend, and you know, it sucks to see that, but because of that, you don't see the same amount of coverage on the protests and such, but they're still going on, and people are still being arrested for protesting, and they're still being arrested for exhibiting their, you know, right to assemble. And I think people have lost track of that in some cases, and I think it's important to recognize it's still going on. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So does anyone else have anything to talk about, their view on current issues? I also want to say that they're going to this weekend particularly critical of the U.S. is we've seen the recent case of you know, a slain or murdered U.S. soldier, Vanessa Julian, out in Texas. And so even these institutions that we have so much confidence in, we obviously see that there's there's cracks in these systems, and that we need to address. And it's historical ongoing, so barely until it's been brought to light are we finally calling this out. So I think something we'll be mindful and be critical, you know, going forward. So that being said, I did want to go over, before we get into open conversation on these different issues of oppressive systems in design and higher education, I do want to provide some context and get everyone kind of on the same page of what we're trying to discuss. So we've kind of identified around 5 different topics, which I will share my screen. There we go. Okay. So essentially, we've kind of narrowed down our discussion to these type of persistent systems and structures right here. Okay. So what we hope to discuss on all these are actually 6 topics. Thank you. We have the lack of representation in design, and I'll start this so everyone can cover that when we go down the list. When we talk about the lack of representation in design, we talk about it at all levels, whether it is, you know, entry level, we're talking about the leadership of design firms in the industry, a representation of different voices in these different platforms. So I would say there's a limit in the professional industry of platforms by which to vocalize these issues, and how design can play a negative impact on community development and the sustainability of historically underrepresented communities, as well as lack of design education. So perhaps, you know, there's a lack of recruitment or the proportional numbers for, say, ENVD and the rest of the state, you know, in terms of percent of Latinx students, percent of Black students. So there's a shortfall there. Lauren, if you want to get into the other one.
Yeah, thanks. So I think for community or personal relationships, tokenism considerations, people of color and those that are just underrepresented in general are often seen as kind of strangers to an average community. And I mean, for me, I think I've never experienced it within the design realm, but for me, just like going down to Pearl Street or going to the grocery store, I often find myself having to smile more often because I don't want to seem as a threat. And it's not like wearing a hijab makes me seem as a threat, but it's more of just like being different, which kind of concerns people on some aspect. And so I don't know how this really intertwines with design or not, except for maybe having more like interracial or just culturally diverse neighborhoods or buildings or whatever we are designing for. I would be very interested to hear more about what that's like in the design profession, as I haven't actually experienced that much myself as of what I know.
Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah.
All right. It's also talking about how there's a kind of with imposter syndrome, there's ultimately can lead into kind of a disconnect to one's own communities, particularly if you're from an underrepresented background in design education and in the design industry. So Fernando, we had discussed a lot last time, so we want to give some context as to why we feel like a disconnect does develop over time.
Yeah, so yeah, Roberto and I kind of were talking about this point, and we felt that it was important to kind of acknowledge. But essentially, as you're even moving from your like hometown from high school, you know, like you might be coming from, like, for me personally, I was coming from Aurora, Colorado, and that's a pretty diverse neighborhood and city to be in. You had people from all backgrounds and all walks of life. And when I first, stepped onto college and the town where my university was located, essentially, I didn't find a lot of people that looked like me, sounded like me, or had like similar experiences that I did. So that's one challenge, that you're transitioning into a different community. And that might happen with, if you go to graduate school after, you might be in a community like that. If you get a job, and you want to stay in Boulder, you might be surrounding yourself with certain groups of people that are not representative of who you grew up with, or like what your community looked like in high school. And so what comes out of that is you might, get a little confused of who you are or what your identity is. It might start shifting into something else and forget about the identity where you come from, or maybe the identity that you represent and you're proud of, because of the landscape. All the different places that you're surrounded with is essentially not the same that you grew up with or that is of interest to you. And so we thought it was really important to really acknowledge that it's important to stay connected with your community and to continue shopping, in those places where you grew up and that honor your values and your background, etc. So just really starting up that conversation of what community do you find yourself in, what your identity is, and how to continuously connect not only to the communities that you're in, but also to the other communities that are also important to you. An example of that, for example, you know, in Aurora, I used to go shopping at a lot of Mexican stores. That's where I got my meat, that's where I got my vegetables. But then when I started working in Boulder and I moved to Boulder, that kind of got replaced with Whole Foods and Sprouts. And there's a lack of representation of those Mexican stores. And so it's important to not go away from that, but it's really important to know, to understand that and value it, and still support those local stores that represent your identities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Fernando. You know, just that conversation with you and Lauren, I already have a lot of things to bring up, so I'm excited to see where the conversation will go. But before that, Erika, if you don't mind talking about this negative perception of identities based on cultural backgrounds and this, or salient identities. Now, when I say salient, or when we say salient, there's, you know, what we mean is that what is perceived outwardly, either what you want to present outward or what folks perceive onto you. So that's what salient identity entails.
Yes.
Yep.
Is my mic on? I'm so sorry.
Erika? Oh,
Sorry.
no worries.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so this, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of these things kind of tie into each other. This specific topic, I view it as connecting it to the whole like imposter syndrome. In terms of higher education, you know, I haven't had a job yet, but coming here to see you, it was like, you know, everybody tells you that, oh, you know, the higher you go up in education, the less people of color you're going to see, and you're like, yeah, sure, but it doesn't become a reality until you're here. And in here, you start to realize that, and it could affect you, it couldn't. Personally, it did to me. And I was reading up this interesting study, it was a podcast too, and it was talking about like racial perception in friendships and how it applies to workplaces and school. And a big takeaway from that was people, in fact, don't just, you know, people will be racially profiling against people who they want to be friends with. And a big thing was like, they concluded, I think it was white women are the most likely to have the most friends. They're also the most likely to close off their friend groups to only white women. And you compare it to Latino women who are the most likely to be friends with any kind of race, but they're also the least likely to have a lot of friends. And, you know, reading that and looking into it gave me a lot of perspective into my own experience. And it's, you know, you don't often point that out because it's like, you know, why bother? But you look at it and you see a lot of issues that rise up from that. And in higher education and being in a, you know, predominantly white institution, you notice things like that. And slight microaggressions, microaggressions don't necessarily have to be like, oh, I'm not going to be your friend because, or I'm not going to interact with you because you're a person of color. But it's like slight little microaggressions, slight little things that people don't often realize they do against people of color, but they're there, you know. And shedding light on that is something that would help probably eliminate them or at least address them.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that resource. And you know, if you want to put it in the chat at some point. Lauren, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I was thinking, I've never heard that statistic, so thank you, or well, I guess it wasn't a stat, but that input, so thanks for sharing that, Erika. It makes me wonder if, based on all the education that is happening about Black Lives Matter and the protests rising up and people just like generally getting hopefully more woke from this whole experience that we're going through, I wonder if that is going to not necessarily flip, but change a little bit. And if more people, mostly white people or the more represented population, if they will begin trying to diversify intentionally their friend group, something kind of interesting to think about. And I'm interested to see where that goes.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm hopeful of that as well. Thank you, Lauren, for that follow-up. In the design industry, I think one of the big things that either actively, as I perceived it, it's either an elephant in the room or it has a very much a platform to discuss within a lot of social spaces or professional spaces. And, you know, we've seen kind of an AIA or within ENVD or DWB specifically. But Victor, if you want me to just shedding more light on the gentrification issues when we have predominantly white and upper class professional design teams being asked to redevelop or to design for communities that are underrepresented, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So with this one, I'll primarily start with like pretty much the foundation for, so pretty much what these teams consist of. And how I previously mentioned that I was gonna like read off some of these like anecdotes from this Instagram account, but they're related to some architects. So Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill, they're one of the, like, I would like describe it as like one of the more prime architect firms in the world. And they're really like highly praised and stuff, but there's been a recent Instagram account created called Black Ad Song. So it's taking all these anonymous stories that people submit to them, and they're pretty much just exposing the firm for their stance on taking any initiative on equity, diversity, and inclusion. So their mission statement on their Instagram account says, shedding light on the systemic racism and bigotry at SOM, experiences by current or previous SOM professionals not affiliated with or endorsed by SOM. And so the one that I'm gonna start off with is just speaking more about like the overall composition of the team. So it says, it fundamentally does not matter when the partners tell us that the firm is listening to our concerns, creating proper channels to address certain issues, etc. These gestures hide the fact that SOM is structurally incapable of addressing problems raised by its labor force about its white supremacist company culture. As long as power is entrenched within a community of partners, no change will arrive to substantially improve working conditions and change power dynamics within the firm, because committees never agree on anything, and committees of bosses inarguably share different interests than workers. And kind of a more individual scale is from a woman of color who worked there. She was, this is her quote, "I was not allowed to take part in an after hours event for the firm because I was told I was supposed to serve and not be seen. I had to sit at the door and greet my colleagues, take their coats, and show them where the restrooms and bar was. I'm submitting this because the person who," and it just says, "I'm submitting this because the person who said this to me follows this account." So,
Very proud.
yeah, I think that just pretty much speaks for itself. These are obviously, it doesn't obviously just pertain to some. I just picked up this one example because it's been one that I've been following recently on social media, but it's, like I said, it's not just happening within their firm. And just like as my time at ENVD comes to a close, it really makes me like wonder and kind of just put myself in a really vulnerable position when looking for the future job opportunities and what firm I'm gonna be associated with, and if I truly believe like even the type of work that they put out I deem as valuable or important to like not only my professional goals, but the overall goal of working against environmental racism and different institutions that just enhance it or don't improve the issue at all. So for example, obviously the bigger issue with gentrification and Denver being one of the prime cities in the United States that has experienced this throughout its history. It's just like unfortunate to see, but I found it really important to be calling out these firms for what they like say they believe in, but honestly don't actually stand for it.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of surface value actions or statements being put out, but if there's not reexamination of the internal culture, of how to best support, you know, your underrepresented staff of color, your women designers, that leads to some huge disparities of what ultimately, you know, the firm can have on the impact of a community. So it's very important that we also not look at what firms do, but what firms are internally as well in that conversation. So thank you, Victor. I would say then to close off our topics, as we explain them, I just want to talk about, this concept of a glass ceiling. And then also with that, kind of what is the trajectory for upward professional mobility for underrepresented designers. Now, this is not just something for designers per se, but we see this all across the, board for different professional industries, engineering, medicine, education, higher education. So, and a lot of times, you going with kind of, imposter syndrome and tokenism. Oftentimes, folk of color and other underrepresented professionals, are put into a place where they feel very fortunate to have the position they have, and that they should not question anything or should not attempt to access leadership by which they can structurally change the culture or the practices of their local industry. So that's where the glass ceiling comes from. You're able to see these high level leadership that can impact change and, can change culture, but you kind of meet this position right before that or way under that, where you kind of just ultimately just kind of support and inform this higher, leadership, whether they take it or they take it down and work with what you give, the type of information and feedback you give. It's all up to them. And oftentimes we see, it's a very surface level type of approach where you have invited someone to join your leadership committee or your board, and you give them the platform to, enact, give feedback and change, but the action in there, oftentimes that's where the disconnect is from. So that glass ceiling prevents, our underrepresented industry professionals from accessing those positions where they can make that big change and bring their identities or critically look at the internal culture to make those changes happen in the first place. So that should be in that trajectory. A lot of, professionals run into, do I have the merits to be this, top level executive or leader? And our stance should be absolutely, you should be accessing these positions. Now, when we get actually into the internal, culture of different industries and firms, perhaps they don't allow it or strongly, unadvised from going in, or even, and a lot of times threaten, if you apply, or if you access the position, you do too much, you're going to be reprimanded in some way or some other, or you're not going to be popular, you're going to be in the position for a couple months or a year even. So there's a lot of internal things that, can be discussed when looking at how the composition for leadership does also impact everything underneath it. Yeah. So that being said, hopefully it gives some context of what we want to cover in this podcast episode. So with that being said, I just want to, if anything, we can start at any point on, in this conversation. Let's go down. Thanks. Sorry, I'll get that link to you, Shawhin. So we can start at any point with any of the topics we touched on. So just want to leave it to the rest of everybody here if anyone has chime in or has anything else to say based on what was just said now.
I would just like to pose a question to Shawhin. He kind of alluded to this in our previous episode, but it would be more so on the whole track on licensure in architecture and how that naturally is a system in place that kind of it disadvantages those future professionals of color. I know NCARB recently they adjusted some things and they put out a new guidelines or something of that sort. But I would just like to ask, what do you see as far as what are your perceptions of the whole licensure examination and how that affects us as future designers, more specifically as designers of color?
what an interesting question. And I'd love to know your thoughts on it. I'm more interested in your thoughts than my thoughts. But I mean, one thing I'll say that might be a little bit different is thinking about sort of maybe I guess, thinking about the history of expertise and professionalization in this country and in the West, particularly, there is this certain way that an expert is understood and their role in society is cast. And I think that, even fundamentally we should take issue with, because I think fundamentally there's a history of, kind of a colonial history, a racist history, and a sexist history there that seeks to set up hierarchy between those who have this like magical power and licensure as a part of achieving that magical power. And they have certain kinds of knowledge that other people then don't have. So this is a little bit abstract, but I think that's an important place to start. There's many people who can build, many people who can design, our cousins, parents, children, all these people have really important insight into the built environment and how to design it. And there's so many ways of approaching it. What licensure does and what professionalization does is it really narrows that to something that's easily regulated and fits serves the interests of the power elite. So it's like, we want specific kinds of buildings, like large, large buildings, massive buildings that express some kind of power. And we're going to have white people and kind of in that building, and they're going to be managing the affairs of, say, a settlement that has a diversity of people. So take a city hall building. So just go to Capitol Hill in Denver and look at these really massive and important buildings that experts have to design. And then look at kind of the architecture of where others live. So it's a very hierarchical thing that I think drives this idea of saying, or drives the limitation of licensure into the hands of a select few. And if you think, before the past 200 years, so many settlements over so many years and so many civilizations, everybody took part in imagining, designing, and building and maintaining and deconstructing and recycling the built environment. So at that level, this is, that's kind of a broader, maybe like decolonizing critique of licensure without getting into the specifics. So I think there's that, something a little bit more specific, and within kind of, if we take for granted licensure and say, okay, fine, that's something that we have to have as, to operate, which I don't think we should take for granted, but let's say we do. I think there are some specific things that one could look at, like even the topic areas that we take exams, that we are examined on. How much do these concern themselves with neutral or colorblind technical things? So, a building's performance is about certain, temperature controls and human comfort. Even embedded within that, there's kind of like the different comfort that, different kinds of bodies have. And so that's not part of what we're going to be examined on. We're also not thinking about other things beyond the very neutral technical. We're not thinking about society, equity, and justice in very profound ways in those exams. So I think the topics of the exam are also something that need critique. I'll just stop there, but those are two things that I think about when I think about your question.
Shawhin, if I can add to that, yeah, I think those are really, really awesome observations. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said like decolonize this idea that there needs to be some kind of body of government saying yes and no and yes and no for people to be able to carry on and do the things that they have been doing for years on years on years. And just to kind of tie that into one of the points that I talked about, disconnection of your own communities, kind of bringing this into a different, essentially like lens. I see that also being applied in other areas. So like, for example, like shopping for food, like you're in Boulder and you see a Sprouts and you see a Whole Foods, etc., and then that kind of just makes you think that that's the right place to shop for produce and food. And then, like for me, just as an example, I used to shop a lot at Latinx or like Mexican grocery stores. So when you're surrounded in this kind of environment, you kind of are told or you learn what is supposedly right and what is wrong. And that kind of goes back to that point that we're essentially disconnecting ourselves from our communities, and to the point where we're even thinking that the old way that I used to do it is wrong now. And now the correct way of doing it has to be what I learned in Boulder, which has to be Whole Foods. And, you know, just applying that example, I like, now that I'm thinking about it, you know, and I have to check myself quite often just to make sure that I'm not falling in this. But like, if your car breaks down, you know, like, where do you take it to? Probably a white-owned like dealership, or a white-owned like name, because going down the street to like people of color shops like doesn't sound good enough anymore. And so it's so interesting, and you apply that to any idea, and you know, that kind of has a trickle down effect. That's kind of where it starts, but then kind of like Erica was saying, then like these microaggressions of like, oh well, you know, like you have a name that I don't really trust, so I'm gonna go on to someone else for this job that has a name that I can trust, because that's what the community kind of trained me in. So it's just really important to check yourself, because you kind of fall into that kind of unknowing sometimes.
I'd say in an extension of what Fernando just said, absolutely agree with all of it. And I'd also add that in terms of, there's also a component of right and wrong. You know, being in, you know, white hegemonic, you know, heteronormative spaces, there's a component of you internalize hate, or internalized racism is what the broader term is, where you self-loathe yourself or your communities. And oftentimes it plays out most immediately in terms of your immediate kind of understanding your identity, but also plays in the work that you do, and who you are and who you show up in these spaces. So perhaps you do become an agent that dismantles community, being a person from the community itself. And a lot of times these institutions, you know, do rely on that, or they ask for that. You know, we did mention tokenism. They ask someone to be the community liaison, but they ultimately use this person as an in-between to secure their own agenda, whereas, you know, not honor the community needs of you know, design person or someone actively working in the community. So I think that there's a fine, I don't say fine balance. We have a fine balance where we're accessing these historically white hegemonic spaces with our underrepresented identities. So how do we you know, find the work that honors our communities and our backgrounds and our cultural values, but how do we also exist in these spaces as well? I think that's an issue that everyone faces at some point in their professional trajectory, even in higher education, design, engineering, all these different industries, because a lot of these industries, you know, have a quote unquote apolitical stance on these, you know, but they're all rooted in kind of, you know, white supremacy idea of this is the way that things are done, right? So I'd say, like, you know, if folks who feel uncomfortable in their professional communities, that's natural, and it's just going to happen. And I think it's something that we're going to deal with, even when we access these high leadership, you know, positions. It's still something that I think even like a CEO of a large firm would deal with if they were from an underrepresented background.
I'm going to say one last thing, it's really short, and then I'll be quiet because I don't want to take up too much space. But essentially, I would say that something to think about is how do you support, or who do you support, and who is it important to support? I think us as a community, we should be continuing to support our community of color, to whatever extent that is, whether it's shopping at their stores, using their services, and because that's what's going to keep them going. Otherwise, they can't keep going because they don't have customers, and then we all kind of just have to go to these, white-owned stores or whatever. So I think it's really important whenever you have the chance to definitely consider shops that are owned by people of color, to show some support and keep those communities alive.
Yeah.
Looping,
Go ahead, Erica.
oh, sorry. Looping like professional career into this ideal. I think I often wonder, once it's time for me to graduate and, go out there and find a job. I think you mentioned this, Victor, like kind of finding a place that works with your morale and like, what you stand for. I often wonder like how exactly how accessible that is, because, we're here as students right now, and we're recognizing these injustices that happen in design and that have been happening honestly forever. And you wonder like, by the time I have to find a job, what is it going to be? Is it going to be, I'm going to take a job because I need to pay my bills and my loans back, or I need to, and I need to take that job regardless of what they do because I simply need the job? Or how do I, in a way, how do I pick a place that works with my ideals? If it's not that common, really. If most firms that we're sent to, most firms that recruit people out of college are really just, high-end residential that have absolutely no interest in caring for communities of color, which is, what we're here for talking about right now. I think that's like, I reflect on that a lot, and it's honestly kind of scary to think about that in the future. I don't know if anybody else feels that way as a student.
Yeah, I feel like it's important that you mentioned the idea of support, Fernando, because like even with some of these design firms, when they do hire a person of color, their like systems in place aren't so they could like benefit or allow them to be successful, which is really like nerve-wracking because like they think they've like just solved the problem by hiring a person of color onto their team and they've met the diversity requirement or whatever, except that person is not being successful within that firm as a result of those implications that are non-existent or the current ones in place that are taken away from their overall success. And I feel like it obviously also correlates to education itself. So again, calling out the needs for students of color, especially with design education and all the different requirements and demands of it. But it's really like almost like scary, I guess, just knowing that those systems of support aren't consistently going to be there all throughout each like design firm. So it's really like how Erica mentioned, like really having to look out for what is going to align for my interests and benefit me in the future. Go ahead, Sean.
Was anyone else going to speak? Okay. Yeah, sorry. So I just, that fear is very much real. And I think, even myself having gone to graduate school for higher education, one thing we always talk about is how higher education is like the epitome of an ivory tower, right? So how do you do this dismantling type of work, this socially conscious and socially forward work, while also be part of a problematic institution, of a historically problematic institution, which is higher education, which was founded, and a lot of these institutions were built by slaves or built by Native American, on Native American lands. So how do you incorporate yourself into that type of work? And that's something that was a big issue for my graduate program, because the University of Denver is founded by someone who carried out the Sand Creek Massacre, John Evans, right? So it's literally on the street of Evans. So a lot of this stuff, it does play down to, how do we maintain this balance? But I think one thing is that to know that you're not alone, right? So when we're in this access these firms and all that, finding a type of committee within it, or finding a professional organization such as NOMA or NOMAS or AIA in certain realms of AIA, as I understand currently right now, it's going to be so important to having these conversations and to creating that type of like organizing people power to, you know, change the culture. So don't think that go at it alone, because that's something that gets a lot of people, or that internal, you know, internalization of right and wrong and hatred comes when there's a lack of a community to rely on to kind of pull you back from the brink and say, you don't have to fully assimilate and let yourself go. You know, there's a platform for you to have these spaces, and that's across all types of professions. So I think coming out of this, we would definitely look at more strategic partnerships, and how DWB is a space to talk about this, not just for the DWB scholarship students or those who've been around, but for those who kind of see the inequities in this, or those who want to like challenge themselves to do better, right? Cool. Shawhin, I believe you had something to say. Yeah.
I was going to say, in everything you're saying, Roberto, I completely agree. I think that, however, a sense of pessimism kind of comes out of discussing things like these often. I think with the last podcast we discussed, we asked the faculty if they were hopeful about things. I think you, Shawhin, said that you weren't. and I reflected on that, and I think like I see your point, and I'm you know, link that to design and school right now, to current events surrounding us, and it's that, you know, we are trying to get past issues and systemic racism, things that have been ingrained, and we're being proactive about it. People are being proactive, but then you realize, well, this is a repetition of history. You know, like this was happening decades ago, and people were doing the exact same thing, and yet we're here today still discussing this, and it sucks because you think, well, if we're doing this right now, but we're having to do it again, like, how much longer until we have to start this again? Or how much longer are we going to keep doing this? Like, I was reading a speech Whitney Young Jr., which a civil rights activist, did for AIA, and this was decades ago. And there he addressed, what you say, the elephant in the room, the fact that all of those professionals were white men. And he addressed the issues with that, and he addressed what we needed to do, but that was decades ago, and we're still here today. And AIA had to, you know, submit another statement disregarding or condemning racism in the field. And it's like, well, you're repeating what you said decades ago, and here we are. And it's, you know, I think that sense of pessimism, you try to overcome it, and you try to say, no, like, you know, we have to get through this, but it can't really help but to think about that still. So.
That seems so powerful to me. I'll just say what you said. Yeah.
Yeah, I think with this comes, in terms of kind of who we are as professionals, a type of caution or wariness, or I would just honestly just say more of a caution as these kind of these responses to the recent happenings are occurring all across, for us locally here at ENVD, for CU Boulder, and for everywhere else. You know, as we're invited to spaces to discuss and to provide, you know, our time and our labor and our, you know, expertise, I think we really have to look and really develop, or helpful, but question the intentionality and authenticity of where this is coming from. Like I said, intentionality is so part of a lot, and people don't want that surface level type of approach. We're like, we don't need that, you know, communities don't need that. I think folks need to listen and reflect at all type of levels, with all different type of privileges that they have going forward. I think we're just so quick to honestly act on things and to carry out things because we think we know what's good, but a lot of communities have known what's good and been able to, you know, thrive in their own way while being oppressed for the entirety of this history of this this country. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to, let's see.
Can I hop in with a quick thought on what Erica said? I'll just keep it really brief. In the dissent class, we were reading about reform versus revolution and like social movements that are aimed at reforming things, versus social movements that are aimed at sort of revolutionizing. And one thing we learned as a class was that, you know, the revolutionary ones don't believe that you can work with the existing system. You have to fundamentally change it. And I thought to say this just because there are these two books sitting right here. One is this, Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, which is a really good one. And this other one is called As We Have Always Done. And they're both by Indigenous, they're in Indigenous studies. And reading their perspective, kind of like the way they think about time, and it seems like we have been taught to fear the idea of revolutionary change. Like we think that, no, this is such a intricate system with so many working parts, licensure, you know, jobs, education, like all these things. We realize, or some of us are starting to realize to some extent, how problematic these institutions are. But I think we all fear the idea of kind of like a revolutionary change. But when I was reading their perspectives, they've seen waves of revolutionary change, and they're still holding on, and they're still fighting for like a deep revolutionary change in the structures here, because they had been part of structures that worked for thousands of years and were much more enlightened, much more powerful, even much more intricate and thoughtful. Like it's not like a bunch of folks in teepees that were nomads. They were like, you know, very sophisticated civilizations all across this continent. And so anyways, that came into my mind in thinking about what you're saying, Erika.
Yeah, and Erika, yeah, thanks for that, Shawhin. That's awesome. I really like that outlook.
Yeah,
Erika,
thanks.
to your kind of like question about kind of how things haven't changed and how we're still kind of dealing with the same struggles, and maybe we will be dealing with them again in the future. I guess the only thing I would say to that is a kind of an approach to kind of move forward for all of us, I think, is to find our communities, whether that's your community in environmental design, whether that's your community when you get a job full-time in a design firm, when you, whatever kind of environment you're in, it's really important to find those allies that are going to be there with you, and grow out your allyship to essentially accomplish kind of even like what Shawhin was kind of suggesting with doing things differently. When there's enough people causing enough noise, change is bound to happen. And so I think that's true if you just scale it to whatever environment you're in. You find your allies, and you find the people that are backing you up, and you kind of move forward with that to at least create some kind of change at your local level. And that's something that I just recommend for everyone, is to, you know, find your allyships and to really stand for what you believe in.
I want to say that I recently shared on our group communications an article about it was just a very random biking article, but it had a context from you know, a Black queer planner, urban planner, who, you know, when going into hiring, going into the professional work, she had, you know, a platform she by which to present herself outwardly to these hiring committees. Said, you know, she didn't keep her intersectional identities apart from her professional identity. That essentially she went into her hiring committees saying that if you're going to hire me, you're going to hire someone who stands on a social equity platform as a Black queer, you know, woman. So if this is what you're about, you're going to hire me. If not, then you're not, and I'll go elsewhere, or you know, be where I end up being. And, you know, to her surprise, the firm actually ended up hiring her. So I think a lot of times we get concerned with professional culture and on respecting that. And like I said, these long-standing institutions that are, you know, rooted in white homogeny and white supremacy, that we don't want to have our credentials questioned. So I think this place, if you have, you know, for those students in ENVD and DWB, if social equity is your platform and has been integrated in your work in any way, you need to vocalize that going forward, and then let folks know that this is your about, because you don't want to be the token. If you're hiring me, this is who I'm going to be. I'm not going to be you know, the person who's going to be the community liaison and do service level type of things. Yeah, I'll get you that article, Shawhin, of course. So that being said, integrate your work. You know, Nate's here, I'm here, Fernando's here, Aaliyah's here. We can all definitely look and see how your portfolio can be more representative of who you want to, your professional identity is. So your professional identity shouldn't be apart from who you are. You know, even myself going into this position, I told, you know, I'm a social equity background. I'm a first generational, you know, Afro-Latino male who went to CU and it kind of knows the different nuances of race on this campus. And I want to use this as a platform. So I'm sure that was strongly considered in me being brought on this, you know, amazing staff that I have so far. So that being said, look, do your research on who the, the industry, who you're applying for. And then if they don't have it, then still go into these interviews with that platform. And of course, I'd be more than happy to help you navigate that when we get there. Cool.
And don't sell yourself short. Like you are just such a strong asset to a company or whatever design firm. And if the firm doesn't represent your values, you know, don't be afraid to keep on shopping, keep on interviewing for the ones that do. You don't have to just jump on whatever firm kind of throws you the best offer if the work that you're going to be doing goes against your values. So just consider that, I think.
Yeah. So that being said, don't apply to a couple of key firms that, you know, sound good, or they're, you know, the high paying, you know, professional ones that'll give you this platform to jump forward in your trajectory. Apply everywhere. And, you know, if you get one rejection, it just means it's a place to grow and to reflect. I think a lot of, speak anecdotally for myself, and what I've kind of seen with a lot of, you know, the students of color and underrepresented that supported, you know, they only apply to a key few because they think that's all they have the merits for, whereas their white peers are applying everywhere as well. So don't feel bad about sending that portfolio everywhere and looking for opportunities and seeing what doors haven't been opened up yet. All right, we still have, I think we're kind of getting at time here. Let me go back to our schedule. All right, so does anyone have any final thoughts as we close out? You know, in this work, I think we're going to be particularly, we went through a lot and we had a lot of conversations about ENVD and CU. Just know that there are resources, and I just want to take a moment to review kind of what CU has prepared via the Odyssey office, which is the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement. I only know that because I worked with them a couple summers when I was an undergrad. So let me share my screen here. So definitely this is Odyssey is someone who's taking a proactive stance on kind of creating campus action, creating, you know, in addition to what the IDEA plan is. So for those who aren't familiar, IDEA is the diversity and inclusion strategic plan for the next couple of years, I believe. But they also have additional follow-up items for that. So if you go into campus actions, I already went into that. There are a couple of actions that have been already highlighted. So updating faculty and staff hiring practices, enhancing student recruitment and retention, implementing mandatory bystander training for all, engaging with the C system and the student government about our practices with the Colorado correctional industries. If y'all didn't know, a lot of the furniture by which you used to furnish, you know, our buildings actually comes from the prison industry. Their argument is that it helps create some type of productivity with those imprisoned, but obviously that's not the case when, you know, those folks aren't properly being paid for their labor, even in prison in these institutions. So a review of campus policies, so looking at community and campus practices. I'm not sure what that bill is. We're looking at an anti-racism module for first-year students. So pretty much, you know, there's a whole bunch of items that have been put out there in addition to IDEA plan. But I think the best part of this actually is, if you keep going down, is this component of resources, on-campus resources. So you have the Center for Inclusion and Social Equity, CAPS, but also these community resources right here. So Black mental health, how to be anti-racist, kind of bringing these community kind of approaches into an institutional platform has been pretty cool from Odyssey, I would say. So plenty of resources on campus and off campus. And if anything comes up afterwards, this is something we should really draw from. I'm sure that our task force that Shawhin and Fernando and myself are on will be drawing from this and actually working with some of the staff members there going forward. So it'll be a great resource for all of us. So stop sharing there. Okay, so one good thing that we're kind of doing to kind of change the norm is we've worked on a design competition that kind of addresses how we can be better designers with a social equity lens, particularly focusing on COVID. So Victor, if you want to give some context, I mean, we're all familiar here, but at least for those who will watch this, once we upload this to YouTube, just kind of going over the reason for the reason for the competition, that'd be great.
Yeah, so we currently have the window open for sign up right now up until July 6th, but we're possibly looking at extending that. And then, like, as you mentioned, Roberto, it is going to be focused on these communities and developing different enhanced features that could possibly help out the communities when it comes to this long-term issue that we've had for the past, like, what now? Has it been 4 months? And who knows for how longer, but it's taking our design skills and assets and making them readdress the current issues and implications happening, and then those communities who are being disproportionately affected because of it. So we have the case studies which will be kind of the preliminary outline as far as like where these designs will be conducted in, keeping it more local with here, Denver, metro area, Boulder, and just really looking at the range of communities that could be designed for as far as like the homeless population and then other communities of color. And then the competition itself will be throughout the next 2 weeks following the closing of the sign up, so mid-July, and then winners will be announced towards the end of July.
Thank you, Victor. So with that said, I think we're in a good spot to close out our second podcast. Thanks for all of our folks who joined us. And like I said, look out for us on YouTube and going to the July 4th weekend. Hopefully, if you look at this or revisit this, or those who are involved, kind of take a moment of critical reflection, self-reflection, and reflection on the history of this country. So that said, stay woke, y'all, and we'll see you for episode 3 here soon. Take care.